All right, let's pray. Lord, I thank you so much for the privilege of studying your word. And as we look at it, I pray you would work in each of our lives. Stamp your image deep in our heart, Lord. Change our thinking as we study the scriptures. We love you, Lord, so much, and I pray it will be demonstrated in this time. In your name, amen. 1 Samuel 14 is a story about Saul's foolishness with the honey and Jonathan's great victory over the Philistines. 1 Samuel 15 is about Saul's disobedience in sparing the king of the Amalekites and the best of the flocks. 1 Samuel 16 is about David being anointed king by Samuel and how David was selected to play the harp to soothe King Saul when the evil spirit came to trouble him. 1 Samuel 17 is the story of David and Goliath, which brings us to 1 Samuel 18. David is talking with King Saul after the victory over Goliath, and we find these words starting in chapter 1, 1 Samuel 18, verse 1. And it came to pass, when he had made an end of speaking unto Saul, that the soul of Jonathan was knit unto the soul of David. And Jonathan loved him as his own soul. And Saul took him that day, and would let him go no more home to his father's house. Then Jonathan and David made a covenant because he loved him as his own soul. And Jonathan stripped himself of the robe that was upon him and gave it to David and his garments, even to his sword, and to his bow, and to his girdle. And David went out whithersoever Saul sent him, and behaved himself wisely. And Saul set him over the men of war, and he was accepted in the sight of all the people, and also in the sight of Saul's servant. And it came to pass as they came, when David was returned from the slaughter of the Philistines, that the women came out of all the cities of Israel, singing and dancing to meet King Saul with tabrets, with joy, and with instruments and music. And the women answered one to another as they played and said, Saul hath slain his thousands, David his 10,000s. And Saul was very wroth. And the saying displeased him, and he said, They have ascribed unto David 10,000s, and to me they have ascribed but thousands. And what can he have more but the kingdom? And Saul eyed David from that day forward. So the plot of the rest of the book of 1 Samuel is set. Father and son have two very different relationships with David. Jonathan loves David, but King Saul envies him. Jonathan sacrifices much for David, while Saul ends up trying to kill David multiple times. We're going to examine the relationships that this father and son duo have with David. We will not cover every story regarding this topic, but rather survey the rest of the book through looking at some of the key points. I entitled the sermon, Good Friend, Bad Friend. Okay? King Saul had David stay with him. Why? Because he knew he was a valuable asset. Saul initially likes David. Actually, quite a bit, it seems. Until Saul hath slain his thousands and David his 10,000s. Let's look first of all at the bad friend, Saul. Bad friend. Verse 10 of chapter 18. Verse 10 of chapter 18. And it came to pass on the morrow that the evil spirit from God came upon Saul, and he prophesied in the midst of the house. And David played with his hand as at other times. And there was a javelin in Saul's hand, and Saul cast the javelin, for he said, I will smite David even to the wall with it. And David avoided out of his presence twice. And Saul was afraid of David because the Lord was with him and was departed from Saul. Therefore Saul removed him from him and made him his captain over 1,000. And he went out and came in before the people. And David behaved himself wisely in all his ways, and the Lord was with him. Wherefore when Saul saw that he behaved himself very wisely, he was afraid of him. But all Israel and Judah loved David because he went out and came in before them. Saul is jealous of David. And this is the dominant theme, really, in my opinion, of the rest of the book of 1 Samuel. I thought about trying to go through in more detail the different stories, but I think we can summarize the majority of the rest of the book in this sermon, in this concept. I think a lot of what you see in the rest of the book is Saul just pursuing David, trying to get rid of David, and Saul never succeeding because the Lord was with David. Saul was a very bad friend for David. He had every reason to be kind to David. David was doing right. David was a godly individual. David had slain Goliath. That's a big military victory. David was playing the harp to soothe King Saul when the evil spirit came upon him. Saul had every reason to be kind to David, but Saul wasn't. The other theme, and I think I'm going to deal with this in the next sermon of the rest of the book, is I think there's a focus on preparing David to be king. And so I want to do a sermon around that. I don't know what I'm going to call it yet, but I think that's going to be another sermon I'm going to talk about. It's kind of this whole situation from David's perspective and how God used it to shape him into the man that he needed to be so that he was ready to lead the nation. Anyway, Saul is jealous of David. Before, when David was not a threat to his kingship, and David was doing things for Saul that he liked, Saul wanted him around. He was a fair-weather friend, so to speak. When David seemed to be a threat to him, he became jealous of him. He's jealous of David's popularity. Everybody loves David. Well, instead of Saul looking at himself and saying, well, what's wrong with me? Why don't they like me as much? Instead he says, oh, David's the problem. Got to get rid of David. Saul is jealous of David's spirituality. Saul knew what it was like to have the presence of God on him. He did have that early on in his reign until he disobeyed the Lord. Now David has God's Spirit upon him. David is living for the Lord, and Saul is jealous of that. He's jealous of David's spirituality, his relationship with God, because Saul doesn't have that right now. Saul is screwed up, and he's not right with God. Instead of trying to lead better, and instead of trying to live for God better, Saul instead gets bitter at David. It's not Saul's fault. It's not Saul's problem. David's the problem. Got to get rid of David. So Saul hatches a plan, starting in verse 17. I'm not going to read this whole story, but I'm going to summarize it for you. Saul hatches a plan in verse 17 to get David killed by the Philistines. He uses his daughter Michal's love for David to try to trap him. King Saul challenges David to bring him 100 foreskins of the Philistines as dowry to marry Michal. Saul was thinking to himself, no way David's going to be able to kill 100 Philistines, but... Verse 27. Wherefore David arose and went, he and his men, and slew of the Philistines 200 men. And David brought their foreskins and gave them in full tale to the king, that he might be the king's son-in-law. And Saul gave him Michal his daughter to wife. And Saul saw and knew that the Lord was with David, and that Michal, Saul's daughter, loved him. And Saul was yet the more afraid of David, and Saul became David's enemy continually. Chapter 19, verse 1 says this, and Saul spake to Jonathan his son and to all his servants that they should kill David. First, he's all right, I'm going to use some devious means to go get rid of David. We'll have the Philistines kill him. That's a good idea. Now Saul is like, I've got to get rid of this guy. I've got to get rid of him. Verse 8. Of chapter 19. When there was war again, and David went out and fought with the Philistines and slew them with a great slaughter, and they fled from him. And the evil spirit from the Lord was upon Saul, and he sat in his house, and his javelin was in his hand, and David played with his hand, soothing music on the harp. And Saul sought to smite David even to the wall with the javelin. But he slipped away out of Saul's presence, and he smote the javelin into the wall, and David fled and escaped that night. Saul also sent messengers into David's house to watch him and to slay him in the morning. And Michal, David's wife, told him, saying, if thou save not thy life tonight, tomorrow thou shalt be slain. So Michal let David down through a window, and he went and fled and escaped. This is his son-in-law he's trying to kill. It's is his son-in-law. He's trying to go. He sends his servants into the house to watch for David and kill him in the night. In the same house that his daughter's sleeping. Think about how psychotic this is. This is ridiculous. Saul is a terrible friend to David. Yet David's still alive. In 1 Samuel 22, Saul's hatred of David, whom he has no reason to hate, pushes him to commit his most terrible sin. Because of how Ahimelech the priest, you don't need to turn to 1 Samuel 22, I'm actually just summarizing stuff. We're going to come back in just a second to those earlier chapters, like 19 and so. Because of how Ahimelech the priest aided David, Saul has many priests killed. Every one of them did not deserve this punishment. Yet the envy of Saul towards David was so great that he commits this atrocity. The very priests that were there to direct the people toward the Lord, because of Saul's hatred of David, all they did, all the priests did, okay, if you read through the chapter, most of you folks know the story, is give them bread. Give them bread. And Saul comes and has loads of priests slain. Bunches of them. Saul even goes as far as to chase David all over the country trying to kill him. Instead of trying to be a godly king and rule, he's all over the countryside hunting down David. Saul wastes all of his time doing something that he should not have been doing. Saul was a bad king. Plain and simple. He was not a very good king. Saul was a very bad friend to David. He had every reason to be a good friend to David. It was his son-in-law. David did all kinds of stuff for him. But what do you see in Saul? You see Saul was selfish. He was very, very selfish. Saul was envious of David. Saul was murderous. He wasn't godly. He was willing to slay the priests of the Lord just to get back at them for helping David out a little bit. Saul was a bad friend. But let me ask you a question. I know you're probably not as bad. I hope not, at least. If you are, please let me know and I'll go find a new friend. But are you like Saul? Am I like Saul? See, are you a selfish friend only building a friendship because of what someone else can do for you? That's kind of what Saul did. When David was doing stuff for him, and he didn't view him as a threat. Oh yeah, David, yeah, we want you around. You stay here. You're not going home to your dad. You stay here and you play the music, and you do all this good stuff. Are you an envious friend, wishing you had something your friend has, whether it is physical or spiritual? Saul was envious of both things with David. David had the population. He was more popular. There we go. David was way more popular with the public. And David was way more popular with God. David had a much better relationship with God than Saul did at that point. And Saul was envious. Are you an envious friend? Do you look at some of your friends, maybe that individual has a really close relationship with God. Did you ever kind of get a little bitter about that? Fix it. Not by getting rid of them, but by building your relationship with God. Don't sit there and be envious of them. And if God blesses them and they're more popular, whoopie ding, who cares? Just do what you should every day. Be glad for them. Rejoice that they have a good image. And if there's a problem with your image and there's a reason it's that way, you've done some stuff you shouldn't do, which Saul had done some stuff he shouldn't have done, fix it. Do what's right. Are you a friend so full of envy? Say that again. Are you a friend so full of envy that you would want harm to come to your friend? Are you like that? I've seen people that are like that. They want harm to come to their friend because their friend is thus and so and they're not. Are you a bad friend? Or, are you a bad friend, Bonnie?
It might be sometimes.
I know I've been sometimes. I can't lie. I'm a sinner. As I'm studying this, it's like, man, thinking back through some times and the ways I've acted towards people, it's like, man, I really wasn't all that good of a friend. Or, okay, here's the other option, the good friend option. Okay, the good friend, point 2. Jonathan, good friend, bad friend, now we're on to the good friend. Chapter 18, verse 1. Chapter 18, verse 1. And it came to pass when he had made an end of speaking unto Saul that the soul of Jonathan was knit unto the soul with the soul of David. And Jonathan loved him as his own soul. And Saul took him that day and would let him go no more home to his father's house. Then Jonathan and David made a covenant because he loved him as his own soul. And Jonathan stripped himself of the robe that was upon him and gave it to David and his garments, even to his sword, and to his bow, and to his girdle. Good friends love their friends like they love themselves. A good friend does not build a relationship based on what another can do for them. Jonathan loved David as his own soul, and this is not the only place here in the book of 1 Samuel that it says that. Multiple places that I'm reading through and been studying this, that he says that. Jonathan loved David as his own soul. Saul did not love David as his own soul. Saul was envious of David. He wanted David's soul out of there. A good friend loves their friend like they love themselves. As I was studying this, I thought of the passage where it talks about a husband and how he's supposed to love his wife as himself. You know, that's men. That's the way we're supposed to treat our wives. We're supposed to love them like we love ourselves. And I don't know about you, but I'm pretty good at loving myself some days. Okay? So let's be pretty good about loving our wives. But not just our spouse, but it extends beyond that. We should love people like we love ourselves. In fact, I think we can say we should love them more than we love ourselves. Remember that whole thing we teach children and when they're little in children's church, joy. How do you have joy? Jesus, others, then yourself. Put Jesus first, others second, yourself last. It's simple, but it's true. And it is so hard to do that some days. Just about every day. Some days are harder than others. So. Chapter 19, verse 1. And Saul spake to Jonathan his son and to all his servants that they should kill David. But Jonathan, Saul's son, delighted much in David. And Jonathan told David, saying, Saul my father seeketh to kill thee. Now therefore I pray thee, take heed to thyself until the morning, and abide in a secret place, and hide thyself. Verse 3 of chapter 19. And I will go out and stand beside my father in the field where thou art, and I will commune with my father of thee. And what I see, that will I tell thee. And Jonathan spake good of David unto Saul his father, and said unto him, Let not the king sin against his servant, against David, because he hath not sinned against thee, and because his works have been to thee were very good. For he did put his life in his hand, and slew the Philistine. And the Lord wrought a great salvation for all Israel. Thou sawest it, and didst rejoice. Wherefore wilt thou sin against innocent blood to slay David without a cause? And Saul hearkened unto the voice of Jonathan, and Saul sware, As the Lord liveth, he shall not be slain. And Jonathan called David, and Jonathan shewed him all those things. And Jonathan brought David to Saul, and he was in his presence as in times past. A good friend is willing to intercede for another. A good friend is willing to intercede for another. Jonathan was willing to go to his father and say, Dad, why are you doing this? David's not done anything wrong. A good friend is willing to stick up for their friend when there's wrong being charged to them. We've seen this happen. Our friends at times have had people accuse them falsely. What do? Do we all, well, maybe, yeah, I guess it's possible. Yeah, maybe, I don't know if that's quite right. Yeah, okay, well, let's change the topic. Or do we stick up for them and say, what you're saying is not right. Here's the proof that it's not right. You need to not think that way about my buddy here. Because it's not right. A good friend is willing to intercede for another. Chapter 20, which I read to you folks earlier in the service, David protects Jonathan. Jonathan protects David. You got to say that in the right order. Jonathan protects David. Jonathan, even his actions bring his father in that passage to throw a javelin at him too, not just at David. Saul throws a javelin at Jonathan. I'm getting the names mixed up. Saul throws a javelin at Jonathan. A javelin at Jonathan. There we go. 2 J's. Jonathan is willing to stick up and protect David. Jonathan was in a situation where he could help keep David safe. He can protect him completely. He didn't have a massive army, but there was stuff he could do, and he did that. Because a good friend is willing to protect another. Jonathan went to great lengths to protect David, and because of his actions, Saul turned his wrath toward Jonathan, his own son, the heir to the throne, also. Chapter 23, verse 15. We're going to finish here in just a minute. So actually, it was not that long of a sermon. I guess I could have camped in some of these passages and went into a little minutia of them, but I think the overarching picture is the important thing to get here. Chapter 23, verse 15. And David saw that Saul was come out to seek his life, and David was in the wilderness of Ziph in a wood. And Jonathan, Saul's son, arose and went to David into the wood, and strengthened his hand in God. And he said unto him, Fear not, for the hand of Saul my father shall not find thee, and thou shalt be king over Israel, and I shall be next unto thee. And that also Saul my father knoweth. And they two made a covenant before the Lord, and David abode in the wood, and Jonathan went to his house. A good friend is willing to sacrifice for another. Who had the right to the throne? After Saul was gone, the next in line was Jonathan. What does Jonathan come to do? Come to tell David, you're going to be King David, not me. I know that. That's a pretty big thing to sacrifice, being king. But Jonathan was willing to do that because he loved the Lord and he loved David. He knew that God's plan was for David to be king next. And Jonathan was all right with that. He was just fine with that. And he did everything in his power to help make that come about. Jonathan was a good friend. Jonathan loved David as he loved himself. Jonathan was willing to intercede for David. Jonathan was willing to protect David. Jonathan was willing to sacrifice for David. Jonathan was a good friend. Now, as I said before with Saul, are you a good friend? Do you love others as you love yourself? Are you willing to intercede for others when they are wronged? Are you willing to protect them? Are you willing to sacrifice for them? Are you a good friend? Really now we could conclude this by talking about Christ. Right? Think of how much He sacrificed for you and for me. With how much He did for us, how can we not but sacrifice for others? How can we not but tell them about His love? How can we not but be good friends to them? So evaluate your life. Say, all right, is there some areas that I can improve how I am a friend to other people? Whether it's your spouse, kids, parents, friends, family, acquaintances. What can I do to improve the way that I interact with people around me? Remember, the world watches us. We call ourselves Christians. We say, we're followers of Christ. They look at us. If we're bad friends to them, We heard the testimony of Christ. So are you a good friend? Lord, I thank you so much for this day, and I pray that each of us would be good friends to the people that we're around, that we would care about them more than we care about ourselves, that we would be willing to sacrifice for